Thank you very much for inviting me. Can everybody hear me? It's a bit challenging to use that lectern for me because I discovered you'd probably just see my eyebrows if I chose to use the mic. So, and also I don't have a copy of my slides in front of me, so I'm actually going to move around a little bit. I'm also more comfortable presenting in that way.
Sorry, moving on to working again.
Yes, sir.
There I am. As I was introduced, what a builder, so I hope I don't disappoint. You're going to get a very different perspective from me, I think. And before I start, because I always like to gauge my audience, can you put your hand up if you personally, or a very close friend, or a member of your family is affected by a severe food allergy? Quite a lot of you, and that's what I always find. So thank you for that, because that helps me to gauge how I move forward with regard to presentation. So from a personal and a professional basis, a number of you are very aware of what a severe allergy is. Building on what's already been said, what's very interesting is that if I was to do a straw poll and ask people across the nation, have you got a food allergy? About 25% would say yes. And that's an absolute nonsense, because the real figures, and you may be familiar with these, are that it's in around 2-3% of adults will have a severe food allergy, and also around 6-8% of children. Still big figures. 1 child in 50 will have a nut allergy. Every school across the UK, unless they're an absolutely tiny primary school, will be dealing with severe allergies as an issue. However, people have food intolerances, very nasty. You know, they may be finding it very difficult rushing to find the ladies or gents or whatever, but it won't kill them. People may be celiac. 1 in 100 people are celiac. Again, very nasty, not pleasant to have, can have long-term health effects, but it won't kill you. People make lifestyle choices. I choose to be a vegan, I choose to be a vegetarian. There may be religious reasons. But the people that I'm concerned about talking to you today are that severe allergic group. But I know it makes your lives incredibly difficult because so many people will say that they have a food allergy. And just as a real example of that, I do a lot of work with school catering organisations, and they'll say to me, my goodness, we've got 50 children with various things. And I say, you can admit the ones that don't have a clinically based and signed management plan. Because little Johnny being allergic to marshmallows, as was quoted to me only a couple of weeks ago, actually is highly unlikely. And in fact, and can't be clinically based, and the focus needs to be on these people who are very severely at risk. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Just very quickly, we are the only UK charity that solely focus on this group, and we're a membership organisation, so we have individual members. We have 140 odd corporate members who support us, all the major food retailing chains, manufacturing chains, and a number of the major food service chains are members and support us. And what we do, our prime aim is to give accurate information to everybody, to all our membership groups, but particularly to individuals. Every piece of information we give out is clinically based. I've got a clinical panel of 20 of the top clinicians, dietitians, secondary care clinicians, GPs, etc., pharmacists, who check all our information. We give support, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. We campaign, and that's why this moment in time is a very interesting one for us, and a very busy one for me, as I'm sure you can imagine. And we fundraise because we get no government funding. Our funding comes solely from membership, fundraising and sponsorship. So you will get a bit of an advert at the end, and I won't apologise for that. but that's who we are. So what am I going to talk about today? The challenges faced by the allergic food consumer when eating out, and you've had an excellent first presentation which gives you one perspective, and I'd like to give you perhaps a slightly different perspective. An update on the DEFRA and FSA advice as I currently understand it. I'm not a lawyer. I do work with lawyers for all sorts of reasons, but I am not a lawyer myself. So what I will share with you is what is currently happening from my perspective, and I hope you'll find that helpful. Changes that we would like to see, and that's a very important thing for me, and also how you can help. Because everybody has the right to safe food, and also eating out is an extremely important experience to all of us, and it would be a real shame if that experience was denied to such a significant proportion of the population because of a fear factor. So that's the things I'm going to cover. So, what's the challenge for the food allergic consumer when eating out? And this is probably blinding the obvious. Eating out is increasingly a very, very important part of the way we live. It's actually one of the nicest experiences that you can have. But for the severely food allergic consumer, it isn't quite like that. They always have to plan ahead, they always have to be vigilant and be aware that when they go in, they have to be absolutely certain what is in the food that they are eating, which of course restricts their food choices. And I know a number of organisations, I'm sure many of you in the room, do your utmost to make sure that the choices aren't too restricted, but inevitably they will be restricted, and the food allergic consumer has to recognise that. And that inevitably leads to a level of anxiety and stress, and they must plan ahead. So this particularly is an issue for young people. Mum and dad will take a child to a restaurant, will check labels, keep that child safe. But around about the age of 14 or 15, you don't actually always want to meet with your mum and dad. And increasingly, you are going to be eating out with friends, spending your time with friends, and you want to be able to keep yourself safe and make your own risk assessments. But that is quite difficult, particularly when you're a young person and you're actually quite nervous about sharing the fact that you may be perceived to be a little bit different. So actually, the whole experience is really quite different for the food allergic consumer than it is for the rest of the audience. So, they must have trust. This is such an important thing. And the most important element of gaining that trust is around communication. No sheets with lists of allergens on them, no written information can be a substitute for feeling able to have a conversation with the people who are actually providing that food to you. I would really like to stress this. We call the banner we give this in my organisation is ask the question, because it's the most important thing. We did a very, very focused piece of work with the Food Standards Agency and with other charities, which finished a couple of weeks ago, and it was called Easy to Ask. Can I ask if anyone in the room actually saw that communication? No. I mean, the Food Standards Agency spent quite a lot of money trying to promote that, but it is just absolutely at the core. And if you do have an opportunity, when you go away from this meeting, there's an absolutely brilliant little clip that's tied in with that campaign on YouTube of a young person ordering food via a digital organisation like Just Eat. It's hilariously funny, and the fact it made my 3 daughters laugh and they thought they'd pass it on means it was probably pretty good, because one of our challenges is communicating with that age group.
But asking the question is absolutely key. And the important thing is you have the answers. You have the answers, because the advice we would very clearly give to people is if you go into an establishment and you ask the questions and you start to communicate and you have any doubt whatsoever that that organisation, that establishment can't satisfy you and give you that trust, you walk out the door. That's absolutely critical. Now, I'm not saying that that happens very often in the establishments that are represented here, but that's certainly extremely important, and that is a key part of the risk assessment that every individual makes when they are going to out to eat in these circumstances. So these are the questions. I have an allergy to X, and as was very clearly mentioned by the previous speaker, yes, we have the 14 allergens. And yes, there are fewer in other countries. I work with representatives from 30 other countries, and we just had a big meeting in Copenhagen only a couple of weeks ago. And we have more allergens than North America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, across the world. Europe has identified these 14 allergens. But people are allergic to far more things than that. And actually, I haven't got the graph with me, but if anyone would like it, I can certainly share it after the meeting, which shows you the breadth of allergens that people can be allergic to. And one of the most downloaded fact sheets that what we're asked about is banana allergy, which you might think, gosh, that's bizarre. But actually, banana allergy, tied in with latex allergy and so on and so forth, is quite common. Buckwheat was mentioned. Pea protein is actually getting increasingly common, and pea protein is being used more and more because of the rise in people who are becoming vegan or want gluten-free diets or vegetarian. Pea protein is the in thing as a substitute when you're making these particular foods for these groups. So yes, it might sound a bit bizarre, but actually there's a rising group who are affected by that. Kiwi. If we were to say which allergen is most prevalent after the big 14, I think kiwi certainly comes pretty high up there. But some of the 14 don't apply as widely in this country as they do in other countries across Europe. So sometimes people say, lupin, that's a bit of an odd one. Celery, mustard. Because in other countries, for example in France, celery allergy is actually much more common. In southern Europe, there's an awful lot of severe allergy to fruits. It's quite a complicated issue. So the thing doesn't start and stop with those 14. So, I have an allergy to X. Can I see the allergen information? Absolutely vital. That can be in a verbal form, it can be in a written form, but it's very important that that is available. Can I speak to the chef about how my food is prepared? How is cross-contamination, and the previous speaker touched on that, which is a whole topic in itself, prevented? Can you make a note about my allergy on my order? Can you confirm this meal is free from my allergy? Now, we don't expect every member of staff everywhere to be an allergen expert. That's ridiculous. But what we do expect is that on every premises where food is being provided, somebody there knows the answers to these questions, so that the person who's in direct contact with the person asking the questions may be an expert, but if they're not, there's somebody else who is. And, you know, there's nothing more reassuring than that if those questions are asked and the chef actually comes out, or somebody senior within the kitchen who actually understands this stuff and can have a direct dialogue. But the individual must be able to assess whether to walk away or to stay. That's not quite so straightforward if you're in a group of friends, you don't want to cause a fuss, you're a young person, you may not even have shared the information that you have a severe allergy. So this is all going through the mind. Some caterers are reluctant to serve people with food allergy, but to be quite honest, We'd rather people didn't make up what they didn't know or couldn't confirm. And it's interesting, the number of times I've been actually in premises, and I always test people out, I'm really mean like that. So somebody might say, oh, I've got a celery allergy, can you provide food for me? And if the answer is, well, I'm not sure, but I'm sure you'll be all right. If I was severely allergic, I'd be right out that door. So I think these are all things to bear in mind. And all staff may lack knowledge, language skills, which I know can be a big issue in your industry, confidence and empathy as well to deal with these sorts of issues. Yes, we're all aware of the case that happened a few weeks ago, and it's horrible. The bravery of that family have been absolutely phenomenal, and what it's done is raise awareness considerably. I've never been so busy. I've worked for 10 years in the Anaphylaxis Campaign. I'm always busy, but boy, now am I in demand. And the number of talks of this type that I've been given and am going to give in the next few weeks is fantastic. That case has raised awareness, but I'm dealing with 6 inquests at the moment, and each one is as complex and has a backstory. However, because of the particular circumstances, the bravery and position of the family, the Pret case is right up there. So for us it's brilliant in the sense it's raising awareness, but each of these cases here have an equally important backstory. So Shahid, that was, she died outside a nightclub in Manchester, and she was served a burger where she was told that it didn't contain milk. It had actually been marinated in buttermilk. The second case about Natasha, you're all very familiar with, and I'm sure that's why this event is taking place. Megan Lee, this is a very important case because the people who were involved in that went to prison, one for 3 years and one for 2 years. Now we're actually expecting that they'll appeal, I'm sure they will, but that's a very important message, and that involves one of these companies not used by me, perhaps not used by many of you in the audience, where you ring up and you say, or you do it online, I want to order something. In her case, she very clearly stated she was allergic to nuts. However, when the food was delivered, it contained nuts and she died. Ishmael Ashraf, this was a case in schools. We're dealing with a couple of cases in schools at the moment, which makes them particularly tragic. And in this case, there was milk in his school meal. Chloe Gilbert, kebab. We always try in our messaging with young people, say, think very carefully about where you eat out. Just think carefully. But young people, as I say, they do not want to be different from their peers. They do not want to put their hand up and say, sorry, I can't with you, or come with you, or I'm different. So there are real issues around that. And Owen Carey, which is one of the ones we're actively involved with at the moment, where there was likely to be milk in a burger. So we're not talking about one Pret case. Gosh, this is bad, let's all jump up and down. Actually, this is an ongoing issue. And, you know, Pret have had an awful lot of bad press, and the PR's been amazing. I actually think if I had that PR company for my charity, my golly, you know, to be on the front pages and still very actively in the public sphere, as it were. But there are, this is much more wide-ranging than just one case. So, the latest advice. Well, the coroner in the inquest sent a Preventing Future Deaths report to the Chief Exec of Pret and also to Michael Gove. And basically, as been said by the previous speaker, raised concerns about the labelling on pre-packed food made for direct sale, and got the impression that they were evading the law. There are all sorts of issues around that the previous speaker would be far more knowledgeable about than me. But basically, as a large company, maybe they could have done more. But more important than that, or as important than that, and I don't think the previous speaker did emphasise this, there have been at least 7 previous near misses. Now, what that implies is, I would hope that every time there's been a near miss, you'd have a full root cause analysis, as we used to call it when I spent my 30 years in the NHS, about what caused that, what have we not got right, what do we do differently. But actually that doesn't seem to have happened in this case, or not to the degree that perhaps it should have done. And what we say to people, it doesn't matter if it's a near miss. If you go into an establishment and either the service they give you is woeful because they just don't know, and you end up walking out of that establishment really feeling that they don't get it, or in the worst case scenario, you have a reaction, and the number of people attending A&E has increased exponentially over the last few years, then what you should do is contact your local authority, go through trading standards or environmental health, whoever happens to deal with it in that authority. Because we know resources are limited in these organisations and targeting is really extremely important. So we are trying to educate the allergic community to actually be aware of what they can do to help protect others. Now, when you get a preventing future death report, it's actually quite a serious thing. And unfortunately, as I said earlier, I go to far too many inquests. So I'm familiar with what that actually looks like. To date, Pret have made a labelling commitment, which is great. And Michael Gove has acknowledged a compelling case for an urgent review of the current laws. What I would argue very strongly, and Pret have reached out to us, which is what you would expect, is that actually a labelling commitment is not the be-all and end-all. That's not the start and finish of everything, and they do acknowledge that. And it's great that Michael Gove's been involved, though I suspect he's got other things on his mind as well at the moment. But his active interest has obviously raised the profile. So as I understand it, and as I say, we're dealing with this and keeping up with it as fast as we can, a consultation on the proposed changes to labelling or the review of the current law will happen early next year. However, as a previous speaker alluded to, the view seems to be that legislation can only be amended based on the type of food products and not the type or size of business. I think this is an important point to bear in mind, because there's a balance here, and there are some very small businesses who may struggle with a significant change in the law. So that's something that has to be borne in mind, because any change is likely to be applicable to every food business, regardless of size. And just like the high street is changing, the way people access food, the way people eat out has considerably changed over the last few years. So things like pop-up restaurants, street food, one of my favourite things is going to Borough Market, all of that sort of thing. If you are thinking around changes in legislation, there needs to be an awareness of how food is actually provided to the consumer in real terms. So, we have actually been involved in discussions with DEFRA, with the Food Standards Agency, with the British Society for Allergy and Immunology. We've worked with Allergy UK, and we've actually had direct discussions already. And as a consequence of those discussions, a joint letter from the British Society of Allergy and Immunology, which are the clinicians who are obviously extremely important in this, because it has to be based on fact and clinical fact. Ourselves and Allergy UK have written, and the letter's been we know that it's being considered to the Food Standards Agency and to DEFRA, setting out our views. So what are our views? And we have to be reasonable. We live in a real world, and the previous speaker alluded to the fact that if you are affected by a severe allergy, you do have a responsibility to risk assess for yourself, and we certainly wouldn't deny that. However, that doesn't mean that the responsibility from everybody else is not there. And as a minimum, and this is a minimum, we think that having an Ask for Allergy Information sticker on all foods would be something that could be implemented by everybody. Now, at the moment, there should be a sign where in every premises, and I noticed there was one in the coffee area this morning, because wherever I go, I'm afraid I've become a bit of a nerd on this, and I'm always looking for how are you coping. But the bottom line is, there should be a very clear sign that says, if you are subject to severe allergies, ask and make this known. Now, we know not everybody does, we know that, but that sign should be as inviting as possible. The establishment should work to make it as inviting as possible, so that the individuals, particularly the 15 to 25 age group who, find this particularly difficult and are the most at risk, feel able to have that conversation, the conversation I talked about previously. And communication can't be replaced by protocols and paperwork. I really, really would stress that. Having the conversation and knowing what you don't know, but knowing who you have to ask to tell you what you don't know. And if you can't guarantee, if you are in a position where the food that is being provided may not be able to be consumed by a person with a particular allergen, it's important that that person knows that and are not placing themselves at risk of having an anaphylactic reaction and, in worst case, maybe even losing their lives. So food, there is law out there, and you're all very familiar with that law, I'm sure, but we know, and I won't bore you with numerous anecdotes, that law is not always being followed. It's not. And, when we get a high-profile case like Megan Lee's, and the nature of the establishment involved there, and everyone draws a sharp intake of breath. But actually, that's not an isolated example. And there are lots of companies out there, big and small, who are not necessarily following through the existing legislation. And we'd like to see that properly enforced. But we do recognise local authorities are under a lot of pressure, which is why we try to encourage people where they have an experience, make sure you draw it to the attention of the appropriate authorities, and if possible, keep a sample of the food, because that is enormously helpful. So enforcement of the existing legislation. Scores on the doors. I assume you're all familiar with that, the 1 to 5 hygiene rating. Which is in operation. That is great for hygiene, does nothing for allergens. And we've been lobbying very, very hard over the last couple of years to get that changed, but it's fallen on deaf ears. But I think now there may be a change of view. Certainly, if you're affected by severe allergies, you wouldn't eat in anything that I would suggest didn't have an appropriate degree of hygiene, because otherwise, if an organisation can't get hygiene right, they're not going to get allergens right. However, to have the allergen-related issues built into the scores on the doors is something we really, really think would be enormously, enormously helpful. Public awareness campaign. It's awful because out of a terrible tragedy, we have had an enormous rise in awareness, which has been very, very helpful. And we would like to build on that and have a proper public awareness campaign to target the allergic consumer and educate them about the legislation. we have a certain amount of reach, but we don't reach everybody because there's a huge number of people out there who don't know about us even as an organisation. So we feel just empowering every individual to ask the questions, as I mentioned earlier. Target the food industry, notably front of house staff. As I say, you don't expect, and I know you're subject to what changes in staff, etc., etc. However, what they don't know, they need to know they don't know it, so they can ask the person who does know it. Educate all staff about legislation and their responsibilities, and empower them to give accurate information, but also targeting the general public, because as I come back to my previous point right at the beginning, it's not terribly helpful to you, and it's not terribly helpful to the allergic community if people say they have a food allergy when actually we're talking about something a little bit different. So, how can you help? Comply with the existing legislation. And the fact that you're all here today and being supported by this organisation, I'm sure that you do. But we also know that lots of cases where actually the existing food safety, general food safety law and the FIC law of 2014 isn't being complied with. All mandatory allergen information should be available and easily accessible to the consumer. If written, it must be clear and easy to read. And, I've seen some of the allergen information that is shared with consumers, just giving them and say, take a look at that. And I struggle with it. And if you're in a certain circumstance, you're out for a meal, you don't want to cause a fuss, just make sure the basics are right. And if given verbally, make it easy. Then I've been into some quite large establishments and I've looked for the sign. Where does it say if I've got an allergy, which I don't have actually? Where's the sign? And it's hidden behind something, or it's not clearly visible. Very simple things that can be done, which obey the existing law and make it easy for the food consumer. And how can food operators? Training. I can't emphasise that enough. That's the most important element, making sure that individuals within food establishments get it, understand about the implications of getting it wrong. They know what a food allergy is and the consequences. They have an idea of what the current legislation is and what it means for their particular role, which may be a signposting role, but they know what the implications are and what to do in an event of emergency. Recognising what anaphylaxis looks like is absolutely critical to the training that everyone has, I believe, in a food establishment. We produce a brilliant film, which is on YouTube, which is used by clinics up and down the country to show young people what can happen if they don't carry their adrenaline. However, it's also used because it gives a fantastic depiction of what an allergic reaction looks like. It was signed off by 20 of the top clinicians in the UK. As I say, it's used by clinics, it's used by other countries. I happened to be in the right place at the right time, so the food industry made that film for me. It cost £180,000. I had to raise £30,000 towards it. It takes 2 minutes, but it shows you what an anaphylactic reaction can look like. Every member of staff should know what an adrenaline injector looks like and how to use one. It's just so important that your training is broad enough to encompass those issues. That's what I would like to see. And high turnover of staff, and I go to speak at so many of these meetings, and people say, oh, high turnover of staff, people are on leave, sickness, language barriers, but I'm afraid they're not an excuse, particularly when somebody can be in a very critical condition as a result of the training not being adequate. So our corporate membership scheme, just a quick advert, and I'm sure these slides will be circulated. We work with all the major organisations. Our current membership is very heavily food industry focused actually, and you can join quite easily by going on our website. We have an annual conference for corporates, which is always incredibly well attended. I always say, if my team, our helpline team that works 9 to 5, don't know the answer to a question, particularly one from the food industry, we know a man or a woman who can. So we work very hard to make sure that the information to everyone, not just our individuals, is accurate. I give presentations to boards, we give input into training days, there's discounted food alerts to our members, and we have a green banner that shows if a company supports us. That's other things that we give if you become a corporate member. Now I'm over, and I do apologise for that, because I know there'll be some questions from the floor, but thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to perhaps present a perspective to you that you don't always hear in quite that way. So thank you very much for listening.